Welcome, everybody. So today it's a very great pleasure to have Mara Felman and Alex Felman in our Global Wisdom Talk. Mara and Alex are the second generation of the Felman family in the US. And our topic for today is just to have a discussion when will be the family actually start, and also what is wealth actually from an I would say from an inside perspective of a very successful entrepreneurial family. So Mara, welcome. It's a great pleasure, and also Alex, very warm welcome to you both. And I would suggest, Mara, I will play the ball to you. Please introduce yourself in brief for the audience and play the ball to your brother. And then let's start this great conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Yeah, my just a little bit of background about myself. I started out in the construction industry, doing construction management, and then kind of moved from that into on my own doing real estate investment. And that's really what I do with the family office now, is focus on the real estate investment, and team up with not so much my brother, but my father a lot on many things for the family office. But Alex can introduce himself.
Sure. I would say sort of two things of my background. My background is originally as someone who studied kind of biochemistry and was more in the sciences. And as a scientist, then I really kind of, this is 2009, so what's that, over 15 years ago, left the US, which is where our family is from, and I originally grew up in New York City, became kind of an expat and citizen of the world, now based out of Latvia in Riga. And basically, kind of, I think those two things feed into what I'm doing with the family office. On one side, with my background in kind of the deep sciences, I lead up our tech, innovation, and venture investments for our group. That's probably why me and my sister don't really do so much together. I'm on the tech side, she's on the real estate side, but I'm slowly but surely trying to get her into kind of real estate tech and construction tech, but that's a long-term plan. But then the second side as well, with me being international, I'm kind of quite involved on the international side of what we do. I run the European branch of our operations, but also kind of more generally help us look at deals around the world. And I'm, let's say, somewhat active in places like Africa, Middle East, Central Asia, occasionally other jurisdictions, and so kind of represent the family in a more international setting. And my two kind of backgrounds play that up quite a bit. So I think that's a good background. I can go a lot deeper, but a good background and for this talk.
So it's once again it's my distinguished honor to have you both on this call. So I will pick up just on a little journey for today's talk, and the journey will be my mentor Jay Hughes. Probably you are familiar with this incredible guy. Talks in many cases that actually the family starts in the second generation, not in the first generation. And you are both just the second generation of the Felman family. Can you give me just in our audience just what is your definition on an entrepreneurial family? You're both just the second generation.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a general mentality that goes along with an entrepreneurial family. I think the interesting thing is me and my brother have very different approaches to our focuses and our like entrepreneurial spirit. That there's like a drive. Both of us have a very, and there it has to come from a core of drive to build, do something, some sort of focus that we want to grow. Um, and I don't, and definitely in our family, we've had that cultivation and understanding of wanting to build, wanting to make some sort of impact. So,
Yeah, I think kind of jumping off of what my sister's saying, I think ultimately it comes down to kind of culture and values within the family. And I think being entrepreneurial is very much about kind of the mindset. It's about these kind of core values around the entrepreneurial spirit. For me, I feel like it's really connected to essentially trying to kind of solve problems in the world. I think the real entrepreneurial spirit is sort of taking a look at the world and being like, hey, we can actually do something about it. We see these in kind of whatever arena, it almost doesn't matter what arena that is, but we kind of see things in the world that we think could be better, and we're going to build something about it and go out there. And I think that's one of those things. And I think kind of tying to the first part of what you said of potentially why the family really starts in the second generation is, I think the second generation, one, it's sort of where you get to see whether or not these values have been passed on from the first to second generation. So is this kind of let's call it a flash in the pan? Is the first generation, the matriarch or patriarch, are they an outlier? Are they the ones who have the spirit and then it kind of fizzles and dies? Or is it something that gets kind of ingrained within the organization? So the second generation is kind of the first generation that you get to see, does this continue, and is there kind of the legacy to kind of pass this onwards and roll the ball forward? And so I think that's kind of the interesting thing is sort of the second generation has a decision to, has these values been instilled in them so that they want to continue to act in the same way, or has it not really been instilled in them? And if it's not really instilled, then kind of the entrepreneurialness will kind of gradually die off over time. And I think in many situations, it does actually die off over time, that the values don't get transferred. And I would personally argue that is one of the main reasons that a lot of families end up losing their wealth. The statistics are, I'm going to make sure I remember everything properly. It's like 60% from Gen 1 to Gen 2, 90% from 1 to 3, and 97% from 1 to 4 in terms of how many families lose their wealth. So it's a huge percentage. And I would personally argue one of the biggest reasons that's the case is because you lose these entrepreneurial values. And I believe, let's say, entrepreneurial values are key to kind of having your family on kind of an upward trajectory. Because ultimately, I believe if your family's on an upward trajectory, if you produce more than you consume. And I think if you have entrepreneurial values, it's easier for you to produce more than you consume. And so as long as you continue on produce more than you consume as a family, then your wealth will grow. And the minute that kind of flips, where you're consuming more than you produce, then over time your wealth is going to decrease and decrease a lot faster than you think. It's kind of an exponential decrease. It's something kind of similar to the Matthew effect, if people are familiar with the Matthew effect, and I think these things are connected.
So there is just a question pops up in my mind. I mean, how I can imagine just your process in your family. Just there was your father to bring up just a baton and give us just to you, Alex, and to Mara. Was there just a framework of values or family missions still exist, where you both had just let's say the opportunity to evolve this mission for the next generation? Or was it just, let's say, a framework and there was an internal discussion, yes, let's move on, we will see? Or in other words, do you both have just the rights and the flexibility to evolve these family missions and values and entrepreneurial spirit? Or is it just in your individual legacy, purpose, and stuff like
that? I think it's sort of maybe twofold. I think on one side, and definitely I don't think at least personally, I don't think I necessarily appreciated this until I became kind of more of an adult and older. But before my dad got into the more family office and private wealth space, he had a sports and entertainment management company. And growing up, this was probably, I'm trying to think about this now, but I want to say this was happening maybe around the time I was like 11 to 14. Mm-hmm. And I got a chance to, let's say, see the example. And it wasn't necessarily something that, let's say, he was looping us in. To be perfectly honest, our father is a fairly private person. So it's sort of, you need to to watch these things, and he wasn't necessarily looping us in, at least into discussions and things like that. However, he was, let's say, bringing us into the office, seeing some of the different, let's say, projects he was involved with, et cetera. So we could actually see it. And I think especially, I would argue that this was before the real kind of entrepreneurial boom that happened. I would say that kind of happened in kind of somewhere between 2005, kind of 2010-ish is, I think, when the real entrepreneurial boom happened, and it became, think of things like The Social Network, where it kind of really blew up. It became a much bigger part of the social discourse, more mainstream. I didn't realize that until afterwards, that it's like, oh, he was actually very, very entrepreneurial really early. This would have been kind of late 90s, early 2000s. Got to see it, and I think some of those things have rubbed off on us as of just something that, let's say, we had an example that we could see, oh, this is how it works in action. And I think the second side is very, very much so, at least in my opinion, both our parents have been very, very, let's say, open and willing to let, at least I'll speak for myself, but I believe both me and my sister kind of to choose our own pathways, and have been generally very, very supportive of, hey, if this is the way that you want to go and that's the direction you want, we're going to be sort of supportive. We may or may not agree with that, but even if we do or don't agree, it's ultimately kind of your choice. And so I think it's been a mix of sort of this, seeing this example. Also, I guess one thing I should kind of add on the example side, when I first joined the family offices 2014, I basically spent a year shadowing my dad. And I would personally argue that year shadowing my dad was like better than any business school. And I immediately went into kind of an MBA program afterwards for 2 years. And I would argue that 1 year was like way, way more valuable than kind of the masters I took in an MBA. But I would say it was never, to your point, it was never discussion. It was never like, here are the lessons. It was much more, here's what I'm doing. Okay. I'm going to allow you to be there and see it, and so on and so forth. But it's also a little bit up to you to decide how you integrate it, or whether or not you take advantage of it, or you kind of have the freedom to kind of decide. At least that's in my opinion. My sister can talk about how it is from her perspective. But we is open and freedom to take that in the way that you want to. That's been at least my experience. And I'll hand it over to my sister, see if she had a similar experience or different experience. And yeah.
I feel like we've come at it from a very different experience, because it took me you started joining the family office from a much earlier in this process, while I've only really joined probably 3 years ago, when I really started focusing on real estate investments. And my father tried to get me involved right after college, and I had no real interest in being involved at that point. But I feel like I came at it from I was less interested in I needed to come to this path on my own. And there was not really anybody that was going to ever tell me what path to do, which I do love. I agree with Alex, as our parents have always been very supportive of what path are you going on? Pick if you want to try a path, go and do that. Which, is really grateful, whether right or wrong. I mean, having that ability to either I want to say make mistakes, but just grow in that things, and be able to choose something. And even if it's not, it doesn't end up being the things, actually learning from those experiences. And I think every entrepreneur will say, not everything is a success, right? You have to try and fail and learn and fail fast. Like there's a great quote, it's really, success is about learning how to fail fast and moving on. And I think from my perspective, I think one of the things that is really education that our parents instilled in us, and the continue to learn and adapt to learning, whether it's more, I think you had a more hands-on experience. I came in it through, because a short period, I wanted to be an artist, and I was making my own little trinkets and things, and which is its own little entrepreneurial spirit when I was like 10. And like that was just a little side hustle that I was doing at 10 years old. But kind of from there, just always had that like drive to like want to do my own thing. Um, and then took a little bit for me to also like ask the family for help because I wanted to do everything on my own. And kind of that's where we kind of come together, and the core values of kind of letting us do what we letting us do, but also like learn and educate through the process.
Okay. So when I say, and it is just what I've heard between from you, Mara, and from you, Alex, as well, is just, and it is just also these indication on which point I start our discussion today, that actually the family will be start in the second generation. And this is actually what I see on the point your case, right? You both just now in a position, yes, we have take over just the responsibility from our dad, from our parents, and we are now in a position to evolve just the framework, what was still existing. And it would be interesting to pick up your opinion on. I've started with my family just 12 months ago, my 100-year family project. And it was on a very early stage in a discussion with my children, will we become a family of a bloodline, or will we evolve our family on a very early stage that will be as a family of choice, a tribe, a family of affinity. And it would be interesting, do you had also these kind of discussions inside of your family, or is it just that you say, no, we are considering now potentially for the next generation that we are not a family of a bloodline, because in many examples you see that many of these families are failed, right? These families, they are very successful over generations. They are more just a tribe or a family by choice. Each member have the opportunity to say, yes, I will be a member or part of this family, but also the right now I want to jump out. Is it also your view, or do you have also these kind of discussions inside of your family with your parents, or is it just a strong discussion what you can have?
I can sort of jump in first. I think my opinion on the matter would be, certainly we're not having, let's say, let's call it official or concrete discussions in this direction. However, I do feel like, let's say, between what's going on with me and my sister, I think we're sort of have a natural direction of this being, let's say, a family of affinity. Yeah. It's sort of, I would say that's sort of naturally how things are playing out. And I do think, especially with the kind of I'll speak for myself, but I believe in both the way me and my sister's personalities are. If we didn't have affinity for each other, both of us would probably, not to say that there would be tension or anything, it just, we wouldn't necessarily be so much in each other's lives. It's just sort of, that's, both of us are sort of like, we allow people in our lives who we want to be in our lives. That's how both of us are. And it's not to say there's any ill will or whatever. It's just sort of, if we didn't have an affinity to each other, we just wouldn't be spending a lot of time with each other kind of naturally, right? And so I think for us, it's more of a kind of naturally evolving process of us building a family of affinity. Then let's say any kind of formalized discussion on the topic. And it is one of those things where even though, so my sister, she's in Richmond, Virginia, I'm in Riga, Latvia, that's a, most of the time, 7-hour time difference, and I don't know, however many miles and hour flights and et cetera. Yeah. We're still talking, I would say, 4 to 5 days a week. On the just about, it's somewhere kind of fluctuates, but on the whole, it's probably about 4 to 5 days a week. I would say it probably fluctuates between, I would say minimally like an hour a day to sometimes up to 2 to 3, maybe even more. So we're probably, I don't know, roughly speaking, what does that turn into? Speaking at least 10 hours to almost maybe 15 hours a week, ballpark, guesstimation, right? And I think if it was just because of bloodlines, I don't think that would be the case. In my opinion, I don't think we would be spending that much time in dialogue and whatnot. And so I think it's become sort of that's kind of naturally where our family is going. And I think with some of our discussions, I think that is one of the things that is important is I believe, right, and in some of the conversations of why does it really continue in or kind of start in the second generation and future generations is you need to have the future generations buy into what's going on and buy in the family. And I think, let's put it like this, ultimately, if you think of a family through bloodlines, that basically means what's holding the family together is almost obligation. They feel like there's an obligation because of the bloodline and the name and so on and so forth to be involved. And I think it's much, much harder to actually hold people together purely through obligation compared to, let's say, holding people together because they actually enjoy it, they actually have an affinity, they kind of, let's say, maybe believe in the purpose and the mission and all these types of things, I think are much stronger bonds. And then ultimately, right, it's almost a tribal thing, right? It's sort of, you build your family as a tribe that's kind of all moving in the same direction and so on and so forth. And ultimately, you give individuals the opportunity to be part of the tribe or not, right? And I think, again, looping back around is I think why you can say the family starts in the second generation is because the second generation decides, do we buy into the tribe or not? Or are we going to kind of create a tribe or not? And if they don't, then it kind of fizzles. But if they do in some way, even if it's maybe a new direction, right, then there is a kind of transition and it can continue for future generations.
I mean, speaking on your like tribe, like that's what I think what both of us are very, even though there's us as like a core and we speak a lot as, or I think for a lot of families, they're like, when they see, they're like, wait, you speak to your brother that much? I'm like, yeah, because I enjoy speaking to my brother and I enjoy like spending time with him. But I think we've also, and even if in our own avenues, are building our team, building our tribe around kind of what we're doing. And then, I mean, I'm always going to you for, hey, run this idea by. Like, does this make sense? Like, or like, my brother is part of like who I get advice from and who advises me. And I think on some levels also I advise him on different, like, and we go back and forth on that. And I will say we don't always agree. But like we both have like a mutual respect for each other. And I also think we were saying about like obligation, and I think that the family, like the bloodline obligation, I think has lessened over time. Like that's for, as culturally here, like less and less people are like near their parents, near their family. So it's really like, who do you choose over time has, especially as a culture, I think in the US, like who is your chosen family? So I think particularly here that it becomes harder if you don't like your if you don't like, or if communication is broken down. I think what you often see in some families is a lack of communication, which like deteriorates the relationship.
Totally true.
And having those open conversations, like me and my brother have many open conversations, whether it's good, bad, good ones and bad ones, but like having that open communication.
So it would be interesting to me and also for our audience, what kind of, I would call it just eldership do you have implemented in your family? Just like, is your father, your dad, your mother standing on the sideline and support you on some critical or important decisions, or can you just or do you have access to these kind of resources of experiences, of knowledge, of network and stuff like that? Is there any any framework what you have implemented, or is it just only, yeah, I have a problem, I call my dad, or can you give me just an idea? How do you have solved this as a family?
I mean, I would say that we're starting to build this framework. I would say because I definitely more focused on this in the past year of building in a sort of framework that one, since me and my brother are both a focus in different areas, but definitely it's a bigger push from our end. Um, my father's happy to open up his network and knowledge and to like show, but like to have an actual system to implement to be able to isn't his strong suit. And I would say we're implementing more of a framework to be able to have that succession in and working through that implementation right now.
Okay.
I
Okay.
I think the other thing as well, I think a couple things. I think one, and I think this is um, I think a challenge for a lot of families as they transition from the first to second generation. I think often, and I think this is something that we see, I think often the first generation will build systems that more or less can, let's call it, only work for themselves, and has a lot of, let's call it, tacit or institutional knowledge either in their heads or, I don't know, on random pieces of paper, or like in ways that make it very, very difficult for that information to be shared. And I think that is something that certainly within our family is a challenge that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with. But I think one of the things as well, and I think to my sister's point is, I would say certainly both me and my father are not as much process people. That is not really our strengths and skill sets and so on. And I think one thing that I will let's say tip my cap to my sister is I think she's much more kind of operational process oriented and is much more like I want to put structure on this. I want to build these things. And so I think that is something you tend to see as you shift from generations is that essentially I think it's because of their own needs. I think the second generation says like, hey, let's actually formalize some of these things because actually I'm not actually sure how this will, like for my kind of almost selfish reasons, it'll make my life way easier if there is some kind of formalized process, because otherwise I'm going to have to, I don't know, I don't know, let's say, not saying this is exactly it, but let's say call up my father every time. It could be a simple, very basic thing. Let's say we have quite a large network just between, let's say, so we have our own family office, but we have a multifamily advisory business. On that side, we have like 40 clients, but then we have probably, my guess would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 to 500 either families or other stakeholders that we've either done business with in the past or service providers or whatever. And right now, let's say none of that is formalized in a database of probably any sort. So if we actually, let's say, need something where we think this group of people could be able to help us, we pretty much have to make a phone call. Otherwise, that information is not somewhere where it's easily accessible, right? And most likely, to be perfectly honest, that information is probably in my father's head. And so we'd have to ask directly of like, hey, we're trying to do X, Y, Z. Who do we have relationships with as kind of the starting point and kind of almost, let's call it path of least resistance of trying to get this up done so we don't have to reinvent the wheel and rebuild the relationships and so on and so forth. We can kind of, I don't want to say quite skip to the front of the line, but you know what I mean? Sort of take a shortcut so that we don't have to rebuild everything from scratch. And I think some of those things are in the process of being a bit more formalized, official, and being done in a way that it can actually be transferred over time. And so it's not, you don't have kind of the key man risk problem, right?
So in this regards, what is actually your role, Mara, and what is actually your role, Alex, inside of your family of the second generation? I mean, what I've heard, Mara, you are in the process to take over the responsibility for the family office in the States. Alex is here in Europe. What is actually your roles and your own definition on your role and Mara and on your role, Alex?
Um, I mean, I think that I'm gearing up definitely on the US side to focus on real estate on a more, I think, and this is kind of coming to, I mean, we're still looking just for the strengths as like and Alex was talking, focus more and more on the operations of like how do these processes flow? Because that's how my brain works. I'm like, how does this flow? How does this, like, how do we duplicate? How do we make this into as seamless as possible? Um, with a little bit more structure. I mean, I love my family. But Alex and my father are much more trial by fire people, and I am much more like I want a structure and please tell me like what am I getting myself into before like diving in. So and I think really for the growth and the, me and my brother both want kids, and he has his stepdaughter, or whoever else might come along to give someone a playbook or something to be able to pass on to. I mean, if you're looking at something for a longevity, I mean, I people need guidance, people need some sort of playbook. I do think it can have some organic, but I don't think without some of these basic structures you're going to be able to do that.
Okay.
I think there's maybe backing up, and I think within the family office context, I think there's kind of two different things going on, and maybe not to say we're exactly structured this way, but it's almost in the same way of, let's say, having almost like a holding company, and then having kind of operational businesses or kind of business units, and I think there's two sides of this, right? And I think we have kind of different roles on different levels. If we're talking about on the higher level, like my sister said, I think she's much more on the like how are we going to improve the operations of this, how are we going to create processes. On that side, I think my involvement and both me and my sister have these conversations, but I think this is much more where I think is much more on kind of a higher level strategy, things about what is our purpose, what is our direction, how do we kind of communicate this. That's kind of how my brain works. It's kind of this big picture, kind of vision type stuff is where I really think. And then when you have kind of the more kind of business operations side, what I'm really involved with is, like I said in the beginning, more involved with the tech side, sourcing tech deals, looking at venture funds, other forms of innovation, figuring out how that fits into our strategy, doing stuff more on the international side. So how do we connect with partners kind of around the world in different jurisdictions, et cetera, right? But I think in many families, like those two sides are I don't want to quite say separate, but they're different aspects that aren't really, they're almost self-contained aspects, right? And they do feed each other, but you sort of can be involved potentially, depending on how you're structured, right? You can potentially be involved with both. You can be involved with maybe one or the other. You can be involved with neither. But very much so, let's say our conversations, I don't know, around our tech investments aren't really our conversations around operational processes or high-level strategy or et cetera, or like my sister's doing the real estate side of the investment, right? And I would say there's almost those two aspects that are a little bit different. And I think, not exactly, but if you wanted to org chart it, it's sort of, okay, things happen almost at like a holding company, umbrella company level. Then you have these kind of operational businesses below, and you could kind of see that, like, hey, we have kind of the family office as this big overarching thing, but then below that you have kind of the sub businesses that are doing kind of specific targeted operations, right? And we not exactly, but kind of controlled different kind of sub operating businesses or daughter companies. Again, they're not companies because that's not how we're structured, but it's kind of, you could think of them in that way.
Okay, so if I understood you correctly, you are more the strategic head, and Mara is more the operational head. Just and it probably. And it would be interesting to me, I mean, Alex, can you give me just an example? If you are just, you mentioned this word purpose, right? And if you are, let's say, thinking around the corner for your family to say, okay, the one or the first question will be from my side, what is your outlook for the Felman family? Over how many generations do you have just an idea to say, okay, that should be now our position to build also a strong foundation for the third generation, fourth generation, probably fifth generation, sixth generation, seventh generation of the Felman family. And if you have just an idea, how do you present this idea to your sister? And what kind of discussions do you have in regards of purpose, legacy, stuff like that? Can you give me just an idea how this works in your family?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think with the way that I'm thinking about it, I don't think I'm necessarily thinking about it from, hey, we want this to be, let's say, targeted for a specific generation. But I do think, at least the way that I often think about things is that, okay, how do we structure a family in a way that essentially we're playing in an infinite game? And then the idea of we're kind of trying to play a game that can last as long as we can play it. And with this idea of, if we can really do that and really do it sustainably, then let's say, in theory, you said 100 years, but in theory that could be 1,000 years,
Yeah.
The goal is really to kind of stay in the game as long as possible. And I think that's sort of often my focus is sort of, how can we continue to play this game for as long as possible? And how can we structure ourselves in a way that we can play this game as long as possible? And I think often, not to say we necessarily have these conversations all the time, but I think from time to time, me and my sister do have conversations around this type of strategy of how are we doing it? What does that mean in terms of, I don't see it as necessarily how we need to be structured, but it's sort of, what kind of values do we need to have? If we have those values, what are kind of the consequences of having those values? What kind of, let's say, kind of tying to the last point, what kind of, let's call it, institutional knowledge and sharing and education do we need to kind of bake into our organization so that, I would argue without those things, you're not going to last that long, right? You can't kind of play this infinite game if you don't have an ability to transmit information over time. In essence, it's kind of talking on a high level, but if you can't transmit information over time, and I think those are the types of things that I bring up, just like, okay, how are we doing it this way? What are kind of the values that we need from kind of an infinite game mindset of, hey, if we want to play this game for a really long time, we don't want to kind of think in the short term. We don't want to think of, this game has a fixed end date, etc. And I think that's how we kind of integrate the conversation. And I think we have I don't want to say that's necessarily a conversation we have all the time, but I think periodically that's a conversation that comes up when, I don't know, I'm trying to think of how frequently, but on some kind of maybe even quarterly. I'm trying to think about what your opinion is. I want to say it's not quite monthly. In my head, it's probably every couple of months, some kind of topic connected to this kind of usually fairly organically kind of bubbles to the surface. We kind of will go back and forth around concepts. And I think that's one of the things that in the end, I feel like on a strategic level, we tend to be fairly aligned. Sometimes I think we might disagree on kind of the tactical execution of some of these things, but I think on kind of the direction on these types of things, we tend to be in similar agreement. And I do also think occasionally, not to toot my own horn too much, but I think occasionally all of a sudden, at least I always appreciated it, I feel good about it as I get things from my sister being like, I never thought about this, but now I'm kind of turning around to your way of seeing things as I'm kind of getting older, or as I'm sort of starting to almost play games that I wasn't playing before, and starting to see that like, oh, now that I've started to play the game in this way, I now understand when you started to say, XYZ, when you start to, let's say, I think a similar thing of like, when you start talking about infinite games and whatnot, until you start playing the types of games where it makes sense to play an infinite game, all of a sudden you're like, what are you talking about? And then all of a sudden you go, oh, this is what you mean, and this is why you kind of focus on things like relationship building. We focus on kind of long-term time horizons. You focus on like, maybe. I know I've always been, potentially to my detriment, very, very focused on kind of asset building. Essentially, asset building over income has been kind of a big way that I've structured myself, even on a personal level. Sometimes that's led to short-term problems, but on the long term, I believe that's kind of really what you want to be doing. I think some of those things have kind of, it's like before not really made sense, and then all of a sudden she goes, oh, I kind of see what I see the kind of, I don't know, rhyme and reason behind why it's coming as you start to play similar games. I
think we also, though, like, we have like, speaking of knowledge, like, we will read similar books, we will like, or share different books that we're thinking about. Because I think that's part of like some of these conversations that come from a lot of like what we're reading, or share knowledge of different things that we're reading or listening to. And which I think is partly what drives our conversation, is just that, having an unofficial book club that we're like, oh, I'm learning about this and these concepts, and then taking it to some of the factors that you had spoken about. I mean, definitely spoken about in the past. I think I still order on some of it helps me understand. I don't always agree with you, but it definitely helps me understand the thinking. But I think you're a very on the like infinite side, and I think I also look at it, I'm like, okay, but what do we, the infinite, always looking at the like the that end game or that long-term period, but also like what are we doing right now to make that happen. um and that really implementing it on that level.
Yeah, I mean, it's in many cases what I've recognized is many people have just difficulties to oversee the next 12 months or the next 2 years, and it's just also with families. And what I've done with my family is that I pick up my kids and put them in a position that we are standing in 100 years from now. And then we look back. What should be done that we achieve this kind of goal? And it's just in different perspective, but it was from me personally, and also for my children, a very fruitful discussion, also to be aligned on this kind of goal, right? I mean, it's often just very difficult to say, okay, what should be done in 5 years, 30 years? I don't have any clue. I will be older, and stuff like that. And just 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 as a side note on this, and the question for me on this point, and I had this also in one of my family meetings with my children. We had a discussion about what is actually wealth, right? And I mean, there's so many misconceptions what wealth actually is, and it would be interesting, and I'm very curious about to hear from you. What is actually wealth for you? For you in a second generation, what is it actually?
Yeah, no, I can kick this off. This was something it's me and my sister had kind of a kind of prepping call between us beforehand, and this is kind of an interesting discussion for us. The way that I see it personally, I think ultimately, and we'll tie two things together, is I kind of see wealth equaling freedom at the end of the day. I think wealth at the core of the day equals freedom, and I think to be like more specific and tactical about, okay, so what does freedom mean? Is I believe freedom basically means that you own your time. and that you have the ability to kind of use your time however you see fit. And you have the ability to kind of control the direction of your time. Let's say you have freedom to, let's say, only have time, the time obligations that you choose. And I think if you have that ability, I think that is what wealth is more about. As I think time wealth is actually much more important than financial wealth, in my personal opinion. I do think, let's say, to a certain extent, a certain amount of let's say financial capital is necessary to have time wealth, mainly because, let's say, you need to eat, you need to live somewhere, etc. But I really think it really comes down to having the freedom to kind of live in the way that you so choose to, the freedom to kind of pursue the goals that you choose to, and kind of, if you don't have those freedoms, then you're often in kind of, let's say, obligations to other people, and those other people will kind of force you to use your time in certain ways, or you'll be kind of forced to, let's say, help other people achieve their goals, or be kind of, or society's goals, or whatever. And I think that's kind of the way I see it, the big thing of what wealth really is. Yeah, that's kind of my opinion on the matter, and I think that's where a lot of people end up getting, how do you say this? Almost trapped, right? Is if you think of someone, I'll give this kind of example, right? If you think of someone, let's say like Britney Spears, I think is a pretty good example of this. Yeah. She has a lot of financial wealth, but because of, let's say, the institutions around her and the corporate structures around her, etc., she does not have a lot of time freedom.
That's true.
Or at least historically. Maybe recently she's kind of, she's had to have a lot of fights and battles, and I don't even know if those are still over, to regain her freedom of time. And I would argue that kind of means, she on a certain level isn't actually that wealthy, even though she has all these financial resources, right? She's just made tons and tons of money in her lifetime. But she's also beholden to a lot of people, and a lot of people control her and what she can do, right? And I think a lot of people end up making those types of trade-offs, and don't realize that actually that puts them almost in kind of a type of prison, so to speak. And I don't think that means they're necessarily wealthy, in that sense. I think it's one of those things of almost the difference between being wealthy and being rich, right? They might be rich, but it doesn't really seem like they're necessarily wealthy. And I'll leave that there and let my sister pop in her 2 cents.
A great example.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of similarly aligned in the definitely the freedom of time in that sort of aspect. And if you take this to, I think when we're thinking about wealth and what we're particularly generational wealth, that we're like, how do you create a system that doesn't put that obligation and institutions onto the next generation and allows them to still be able to make those choices? And I think that's also like kind of going back, is that the second generation and building this tribe, or it either rejects those, because sometimes those institutions from the first generation can be very stringent to the second generation. And how does that get passed along? And because I think that is kind of what many people in wealth are striving, is the sense of freedom of time and kind of control, as well as some sense of balance and happiness that goes along with it. So I think it also, it's really an inner wealth, what more comes from internally than an external factors. But I do believe you kind of need a minimum financial wealth to be able to achieve that, because to have some of the more basic needs satisfied.
Yeah, I mean it's great to hear, and I mean, in many cases, what I talk often, I mean, wealth is just more than money, right? And money is only, if you want, rocket fuel. What you should be decide, okay, how I should be used this kind of rocket fuel for what, right? And then most often this kind of discussion will be start, and it will be end probably nowhere. So before I come up with my final question for today, I'm very grateful to have you both on this conversation. It's very fruitful for me and for our audience as well. And my last question is for today, and I ask them quite often, is: can you imagine just for a minute that we three of us have just the opportunity to schedule a call in 500 years from now? And can I pick up your view, just how will the Felman family look like in 500 years? What is your perspective also on the society? And if we will see over the next decades and over the next centuries, more families, they have become wealthy, what will be your advice on these families? What should they do? What should they consider?
I mean, I think that's quite a good question, and I like it a lot. It's quite a good thought experiment. It's really interesting because I feel like there are certain things. It's interesting. I feel like in a lot of ways the core parts would actually be very, very similar. And then I'm going to almost maybe backing up and changing how I express this. And maybe this is getting a little bit too sciencey, but I almost see this as almost similar to genetics. And when you have genetics, you have two things. You have kind of genotypes and phenotypes, and this might be getting a little bit technical, but you have the kind of genotypes, which is kind of the underlying genetics of the organism, and then you have your phenotypes, which is basically how those genetics are expressed in the environment, and how do those play out when the genetics kind of interact with the rest of the world. And I think to a certain extent in this conversation, I think in a lot of ways, let's say the genotype of the family in 500 years, let's say assuming we do this kind of, let's call it successfully for lack of a better term, I think would actually be very, very similar to now. I think the DNA of what carries a family across is not completely stable over time, but I think there's kind of similar traits that allow families to be successful over time. I think the phenotype of how does that get expressed in 500 years, I think that becomes a much more speculative, if not almost science fiction type of conversation. I could, getting in that side, I could very easily see this being, I don't know, maybe multiplanetary, maybe multidimensional, a couple of these types of things. But I think some of the core things, right, is I think, assuming our family is around in 500 years, I think we'd still be very, very entrepreneurial. And again, my definition of entrepreneurial is essentially providing value to the world. And what is providing value to the world is looking at the world, solving problems. Again, I don't imagine I know what the problems of the world will be in 500 years. But I can imagine there will be, I think almost definitionally there will be problems in 500 years. I think just the way I see the world, I think there's a never-ending supply of dragons for us to fight. That we will be on a never-ending hero's journey. There's essentially an unlimited amount of unknown unknowns, and at some point those unknowns come to the surface, and we have to deal with them. And when we deal with them, there becomes opportunities to, when you kind of figure out, okay, now we have to deal with this. What can we do? And having an entrepreneurial mindset is how you go. It's essentially the method of killing dragons. Let's call it that from a mythological point of view. And so I think that needs to be in the family, this method of killing dragons. And so I see that being there. I would imagine, I think this is one of the things that would be, and I don't even know, right? If we're around in 500 years, by this point, there'll be probably multiple branches, if not multiple splits of the family. And I don't know how that becomes, and I've talked to a number of this already becomes a problem around generation 3, generation 4. I've talked to a number of families who are farther along. At that point, relatively quickly, all of a sudden you have a generation of, I don't know, 50 people, 100 people, etc. It becomes actually similar to managing kind of a Fortune 500 company, just to kind of keep everyone together. That becomes its own challenge. Maybe you have splintering, etc. I'm not quite sure how that plays itself out. And you know, how many branches of the Felman family tree are there in 500 years? That's hard to say. So that I think is going to be a challenge. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I want to mention. I don't know. I'll throw some of the phenotypes. I do think we might be multiplanetary, so I don't know. Maybe there's going to be, if I had to guess, just throwing this out there, I'd imagine my branch of the tree is probably going to be on another planet. If I had to guess, maybe we're on Mars, maybe we're on Jupiter. If I had to guess, we're the ones who are doing that. Maybe there's going to be the strong kind of digital versus real world, something, or cyborgs or whatever. I'm trying to think of what else is sort of some of the big kind of phenotype type stuff on the world. Yeah.
500-year thoughts. I mean, it's I think I agree with you that there's definitely, I think there will be some core values. As long as the success of the family, I don't think those that will change what 500 years from now looks like. I mean, you said some of the things. I also feel like VR or some sort of virtual reality system in play. Um, I think the solving problems, and I think that's really that as long as it's gonna come from that entrepreneurial spirit. And to you said what to say families is, I would say build that spirit within your children or the next generation to continue that legacy, and continue moving in that direction.
So then I would say the Felman family is still exists in 500 years from now, and it will be a very, very strong tribe. And what I mean by a very strong tribe is a tribe by relevance and a strong significance, because that is what, from my perspective, it just crested today and also in the next centuries. So for now, Mara, it was my pleasure. And also, Alex, it was my pleasure too. And I would be more than happy if we can continue this kind of discussion, probably on a topic, and that was a little bit on the sideline today on governance. I mean, so many people in so many families talk about governance, but what I've recognized is in many cases, yeah, talk to 10 people, what is governance, and you get 20 responses, and nobody actually knows what is actually a governance, right? It would be very helpful to pick up this kind of opportunity to give just other families just an idea how can just these decision framework can work very well, and that is just in the end of the day just a core.